Ladies and gentlemen, fentanyl has been a big problem, especially coming into the US from both China and Mexico. And it's very hard to detect, and you don't really need a lot of fentanyl to add into whatever drugs you're selling. And they add fentanyl into virtually everything now. I mean, there's so many things that people just add it, and most of the time the average drug user don't even know the fentanyl is there in many cases. This audio came out in NPR September 5th, 2019. Fentanyl as a dark web profit center, from Chinese labs to US streets. I'm going to go ahead and play this.
This is Fresh Air. I'm Terry Gross. Nearly 70,000 Americans died from drug overdoses last year, and a rapidly growing number of deaths are attributed to the powerful synthetic opioid fentanyl. Our guest, journalist Ben Westhoff, says fentanyl is now killing more Americans annually than any other drug in American history. Dealers are adding fentanyl to heroin and other drugs, and users often have no idea they're getting it or how much they may be using. In a new book, Westhoff explores the manufacture, sale, and use of fentanyl and other synthetic drugs. He says they're often made in China and easily purchased over the internet. The Pablo Escobars of today are coming out of China, he writes, and they often operate free and in the clear within the boundaries of their country's own laws. In researching the book, Westhoff interviewed dealers operating on the dark web and visited companies in China making fentanyl and its chemical components. Ben Westhoff has written about culture, drugs, and corruption in the Wall Street Journal, Rolling Stone, and other publications. He spoke to Fresh Air's Dave Davies about his new book, Fentanyl Inc., How Rogue Chemists Are Creating the Deadliest Wave of the Opioid Epidemic.
Well, Ben Westhoff, welcome to Fresh Air. Let's start with a basic. What is fentanyl exactly?
Fentanyl was originally formulated as a medical drug, something that was used in stuff like open heart surgery and end-of-life care. It's a opioid that is 50 times stronger than heroin, 100 times stronger than morphine. But how we hear about it most now is as an illicit narcotic that is sold and used illegally.
Yeah, I mean, you make a point early in the book that there's a distinction between opiates, that's opiates, which are derived from the poppy plant, and opioids, which, hit the same receptors in the brain as opiates?
Yes, the difference is that they're manufactured in labs, so they're completely synthetic, and nowadays almost all of the illicit fentanyl is made in China.
This was invented by a guy named Paul Janssen. When?
That's correct. In 1959, he was monkeying around with the chemical structure of morphine, and he came upon fentanyl, and it had some advantages. It acted faster, it was stronger, and so it quickly became an important medical drug.
Right, and when we say he was monkeying around with him, he was a legitimate chemist, right, working for a pharmaceutical company, his own company, right?
That's right. He started his own company, and then not too long afterwards, it was sold to Johnson & Johnson. And Johnson & Johnson today makes the fentanyl patch from the drug that Paul Janssen invented.
And what is it used for? What are the legitimate uses of it?
It is also a medical drug, and people who have cancer, people who have serious pain, it's used for pain management.
Right, so it relieves pain. How did it get to be a drug of choice for opioid users?
This was really a long time coming, and it's something that nobody really saw coming, including the DEA. As recently as 2015, they didn't think fentanyl would be a problem. But basically, it's so cheap to produce, and it's so powerful that drug dealers began realizing it was a way to increase their profits, and so they started cutting it into heroin. And nowadays, it's almost impossible to find pure heroin on the street, and fentanyl is also being cut into cocaine, prescription pills, and that's how Prince died, and it's a terrible scourge.
Right, and do people know they're getting fentanyl, or how much?
Most people do not want fentanyl. They don't realize that it's in their heroin or it's in these fake prescription pills. And oftentimes, even if they do know there's fentanyl, they don't know how much. And since only 2 milligrams of fentanyl is enough to kill you, just the slightest miscalculation can make people overdose and die. And fentanyl in places like St. Louis, where I'm from, is actually starting to catch on as a drug unto itself. It is so much stronger that longtime addicted users who don't even get high on heroin anymore, it just sort of maintains them and stops them from getting sick. Now with fentanyl, they can actually feel that feeling again of being high.
What's the appeal to dealers and manufacturers of this?
The appeal is that it's so much cheaper to make and it's so much more powerful. So while the cartels in Mexico have these fields of opium poppies, it's very exposed to law enforcement. It takes a long time to grow, and it costs more to make, whereas fentanyl in a Chinese lab can be made quickly. It's very hard for law enforcement to crack down on it as well.
Right, and a lot lighter and simpler to ship, I suppose.
Exactly, and so it's generally either shipped through the mail from China directly to U.S. dealers or consumers, or else the fentanyl ingredients or the fentanyl itself is shipped to the Mexican cartels, who then send it north through the border into the U.S.
So give us a sense of the scale of the problem. How many people are overdosing because of fentanyl?
When it comes to the opioid epidemic, there are signs that it's maybe kind of leveling off, and deaths from prescription pills and heroin are actually down in recent years. But fentanyl deaths keep climbing, and it's up around 30,000 a year for estimated statistics for 2018.
Wow, and that's because fentanyl is in so many other products, and it's sort of replacing heroin because of its convenience and potency.
Exactly, and it's getting to be that fentanyl can be in almost any drug. We're even seeing cases where ecstasy pills taken by ravers now sometimes have fentanyl, so it's getting to be that almost all drugs are unsafe.
You said that the fentanyl scourge represents the third wave of the opioid epidemic. What are the other two?
The opioid epidemic began with prescription narcotics like OxyContin, and doctors started prescribing those at a really high rate in the 90s and the 2000s. And oftentimes when people's prescriptions ran out, they were addicted. And so in order to maintain their addictions, these were law-abiding citizens who turned to buying street heroin. And that was the second wave of the opioid epidemic. And now fentanyl represents the third wave.
So fentanyl is a synthetic drug, right? Part of a class of drugs that kind of are known in the business as NPS, that's novel psychoactive substances, right?
That's right.
Who came up with these drugs? I mean, they're all different molecular formulas, right?
Ironically, almost all of these new drugs were made by legitimate scientists for medical and scientific purposes. In the days before the internet, it was kind of hard to track down their research. You had to go to university libraries and places like that. But in the internet age, all of these papers and their chemical formulas became available to anybody. And so rogue chemists began scouring this scientific literature and appropriating these medical drugs for use as recreational drugs. And they began to be sold over the internet. And whereas there were only, a few handfuls of drugs 100 years ago, now there's literally 100 new drugs or more every year.
Yeah, there are 50 listed in an appendix to your book. This part of your book has some really interesting characters in it. These chemists who followed up on the leads of academics and began developing various kind of classes of synthetic drugs. Give us a sense of what their motives were. Like one of them was this guy, Alexander Shulgin, went by Sasha, right? What was he up to? What did he want to do?
Yeah, Sasha Shulgin started his career working for Dow Chemical, but his real interest was in psychedelics, and he thought they could be used as tools to help with medical science, psychiatry, even religion. And so he began tinkering with these different psychedelic chemical structures. And eventually Dow had enough of him, so he worked on his own piece of land. And all day long, he created these new psychedelics and then sampled them himself to see if anything happened. He started by taking a very tiny dose and worked his way up until he felt an effect. Eventually, he created so many new drugs that he released a couple of books that are basically cookbooks for how to synthesize these drugs. And his popularity really exploded. He also popularized MDMA, also known as ecstasy, and became known as the godfather of ecstasy.
Right. And did he imagine, hundreds of thousands of young people taking this stuff? Was he cool with that?
He was, and that's why he published these books. He wanted everybody to have access. Now, in his defense, psychedelics are much less toxic and much less likely to cause overdoses than the narcotics that we've been talking about. But, as you can imagine, the DEA did not take too kindly to this and ended up raiding his facility.
Right. And nowadays, a lot of those psychedelics are being laced with fentanyl, and they can be deadly, right?
Well, there's a lot of problems with the techniques that he created, because that's exactly the same techniques that these rogue chemists all over the world are using to develop drugs that are less benign. And not just fentanyl, but there are dozens and dozens of fentanyl analogs, as they're called, which are made by just barely tweaking the chemical formula of fentanyl to create something new that's now legal.
Right, which makes it hard to regulate, right? You make a slight change in the formula, and suddenly it's not an illegal drug anymore, right?
Exactly. And in China, they've had the biggest problem with this. Whereas in the U.S., they sort of have a blanket ban of everything that's anything like fentanyl. In China, until recently, they had to regulate each drug one by one. And that's been the source of all this friction with President Trump and China's President Xi. And it plays in with the trade war, and it's really caused a lot of problems.
One of the things that's interesting about using fentanyl is that you don't necessarily need a street dealer to get it. A lot of it can be gotten on the dark web. I mean, for those that aren't savvy, explain what the dark web is.
The dark web, it consists of web pages that use a disguise protocol. And so it's impossible to know who's making the pages, and it's very easy to send these disguised messages. So it's impossible to know where they're coming from, and it's impossible to read them unless you have the code to unscramble them.
But it's not hard for anybody who's interested to get there and look for stuff, right?
No, it's not hard to use at all. You can do it from your smartphone.
So you explored this world a bit, found, open marketplaces of drugs, right? And you reached out to a dark web dealer who goes by the name U4IA. You traded some encrypted messages, I think, and then eventually he agreed to meet with you, right?
Yeah.
Why would he do that?
I was surprised too. I think for him, he was an addicted opioid user himself, and he actually claimed to be doing some good in the world, if you can believe that. He was selling a nasal spray with a type of fentanyl, and it was very cheap. And, despite the fact that he was selling this type of fentanyl over the dark web, his contention was that he was helping addicted users like himself maintain their addiction affordably.
And do we have any idea about how safe or dangerous this mist is?
I can't imagine it's very safe. I mean, I would certainly never trust something like that to someone I didn't know were I a user, because even the slightest miscalculation can have fatal consequences. But I was actually able to meet him in person. He was kind of a physically big guy, and I was a little intimidated when I saw him, but he was there with his little daughter, and he obviously cared about her, and that's why he said another reason he was doing what he was doing was to support his family.
Right. How did he get into this? He was a user and needed income?
He has been a user of a number of drugs over the years, and I believe he was also addicted to meth at one point. And he said he had anxiety issues, and starting to use these exotic opioids relieved his stress. And he has kind of a blue-collar job that doesn't pay the bills. And he originally tried street dealing, but that didn't make the money compared to the sort of worldwide potential customer base that he found on the dark web.
Do you have a sense of the scale of his operation? How much he ships, how much he makes?
The profit margins are astronomically high, so he bought just a very small amount of this fentanyl analog from China and was able to make something like 100 times or more profit based on what he was selling. And so far, he had only sold a few $1,000s worth of this new batch. So I didn't get the sense that he was a big kingpin, but it was certainly a lot of money being exchanged.
When you connected with him and asked him to meet and he agreed, he said, I think I'd like to have a voice. Does he see himself as different from other dealers on the dark web?
I think he does. And I think it's fair to say that a lot of dark web dealers really don't care who they're selling to. They don't care what it's being used for, the amounts. But at the same time, there are other dark web dealers I talk to who specialize in psychedelics. They specialize in drugs they think should be legal medical drugs to help people with things like PTSD, like I talked about before. And so it's a whole wide swath of different types of people on there.
How do they ship stuff without putting themselves or buyers at risk?
It's surprisingly easy to send these drugs through the mail, and that's been another big bone of contention that President Trump has been tweeting a lot about recently. The amounts needed are so small that just a tiny amount, hundreds of doses can fit in an envelope, and it's often mislabeled for starters. It doesn't say what it really is on the customs declarations, and also it's often hidden inside other products. So this guy I was talking to, U4IA, said that he received his in like a cleaning product, I think something like an Ajax can, and from the outside it just looked exactly like a cleaning product, and you would have had to open it up to see what was inside.
That was the material that he got from, a Chinese manufacturer?
Yeah, exactly.
Right. And then when he ships his stuff, I'm assuming he was in the United States sending it here and elsewhere?
Yes, and he showed me the little nasal spray mister that he sends, and it does look like something you would buy at CVS or Walgreens. It has the little label, and it looks totally innocuous.
Right. What do you need to make fentanyl? Anybody who saw the TV series Breaking Bad knows that, getting the raw materials for making that was a chore. But what are the chemicals you need to make fentanyl?
Fentanyl is similar to meth in that you really need a specific precursor chemical, is what it's called. So for meth, you might remember that all these sort of backwoods American cooks were using Sudafed, and so they would go to a local drugstore and walk out with all of the Sudafed in the store, and then they would harvest the pseudoephedrine from those pills to make meth. And it's the same thing with fentanyl. You need a different precursor chemical, but without that chemical, you can't make fentanyl. And so that's why China plays in so heavily, because even though the Mexican cartels are ultimately sending so much fentanyl into the U.S., they rely on the precursor chemicals made in China.
So the pattern is that the components of fentanyl are manufactured in China, shipped to Mexico, where then the cartels actually synthesize the fentanyl itself and ship it to the United States?
Exactly.
And do people get fentanyl directly from China too, either dealers or users?
Yes, dealers and users get it also directly from China, right through the U.S. mail and even FedEx and UPS.
China is a huge player in the world of fentanyl and other synthetic drugs. And it's interesting. I know you traveled there and you did a lot of research. You say it's not a narco state, you said, where, leaders are corrupted and bought by cartels. What is the Chinese government's attitude towards drug sales and use among its own citizens?
China has big problems with drugs like heroin and meth and ketamine, but they don't have a fentanyl problem like we do in the U.S. And so a lot of people think this is why they haven't sufficiently cracked down on this huge industry that they have. It's a massive chemical and pharmaceutical industry, the biggest in the world, and a small part of it, but still very large, is dedicated to illicit fentanyl.
Right.
Now, ladies and gentlemen, they are anticipating that because fentanyl is included in so many of the drugs out here, that the actual death rate in the U.S. will go up. There's going to be another spike in the deaths that occur from drug usage, even more than what's going on now. So, it's a reason why you're starting to see Trump go back and forth with China over the fentanyl, but nothing has been done. And with the trade war going on, I doubt if China's going to do anything. They haven't all the way up until now. They just pretty much tell the U.S., you are responsible for your junkies. And that's about as far as China goes. Telling the U.S. that, it's their responsibility to deal with their junkies and don't blame them for what's going on in the U.S. But they don't actually do anything to stop the drugs from coming in. So, please leave your comment and subscribe. Don't forget to hit on the notification bell. And I'll see you on the next video. Peace, family.